And joining me now from San Antonio is Democratic presidential candidate, former San Antonio mayor and former housing secretary Julian Castro. Secretary Castro, welcome back to Meet the Press. Before we get into policy prescriptions or anything like that, I know you have a lot of contacts in Texas government. What more can you tell us about what you've learned overnight?
Well, I think that most of the facts that we know at this point have been released. That there were about 20 individuals who were killed, that this gunman was in his early 20s, a white male. And of course there's tremendous amount of grief and sadness, and all of us are thinking about the families there in El Paso who have been victimized. This is going to spark a couple of conversations. One is on domestic terrorism and one is on our gun culture. What do you see here as sort of what we need to start tackling? We need to tackle both of these things, and unfortunately, as we've seen time after time, they're related. On the one hand, it's clear what we can do to cut down on the number of these incidents. We need common sense gun reform. This happened in Texas, a state that has one of the highest rates of gun ownership. It has concealed carry, it has open carry. The shooter knew that he would be walking into a store where a lot of people would be carrying a gun. That did not deter him. The answer is not more people with guns. The answer is to make sure that, especially these semi-automatic weapons, these weapons of war, are not out on the street, and that we do things like universal background checks and red flag laws so that people who shouldn't have their hands on weapons don't get them in the first place. At the same time, there's a toxic brew right now in the United States, and this is just one more example of that, of white nationalism. The manifesto that apparently this shooter wrote that says that Hispanics are taking over the state of Texas and changing the country, this echoes the kind of language that our president encourages, talking about invaders, and that are, others who talk about people bringing disease and changing the culture, this idea of replacement. There is this very toxic brew of white nationalism that is arising, and I know that that doesn't reflect by any means, the vast majority of Americans. But unfortunately, what we see is an increasing number of these incidents, these mass shooting incidents. And so we need to pay attention to this, and we need to do something about this. The FBI has identified this. The FBI director has said that this is a particular problem right now in the United States.
The President of the United States has not.
In addition,
the President of the United States has not. Right? We've had the director of the FBI has acknowledged that there is a rise in white nationalism that's tied to domestic terrorism. The president has not. Is there any constructive role he can play, or because of how often he uses the language of racial resentment, does he just not have the credibility to do anything to fix this problem?
Yeah, this president started his campaign in 2016 on a path of racial resentment and fanning the flames of bigotry. That's how he believes he won in 2016. That's how he thinks he's going to win in 2020. Unfortunately, he doesn't have any credibility anymore. When he didn't step up right away and condemn the neo-Nazis after Charlottesville, allowing that crowd for 13 seconds to chant "Send her back" a couple of weeks ago, he doesn't have any credibility. But you know what, Chuck? Like all Americans, I still hope that this president will do what most presidents have done throughout our history, which is to realize that we have to do everything that we can to try and unite Americans instead of fanning the flames of bigotry.
Do you worry that
he has to be a big enough man, a big enough person in these moments to do that.
Do you worry for the safety of Hispanic Texans, of Hispanic Americans around the country right now?
I do, because what's happened under this president and in this what's going on right now is that Hispanics and especially Latino immigrants are being talked about as invaders, as the other, as something that's very bad. And what's so ironic is that a community like El Paso, it's as wonderful as it is, as beautiful as it is, because there's this bicultural nature to it, where people of different backgrounds have gotten along well for a long time, who understand each other, who appreciate each other's differences. It's actually an example of the America that we can create that's successful. I hope that we'll go in that direction instead of the direction that this president and others are trying to take us in.
George P. Bush called this white terrorism. Not many other Republicans have used that language. Do you think do you think others need to in order to get the president to see this problem?
I wish they would call it out, that they would be honest about what's happening here. Because you know very well, and I know very well, that if this had been somebody of the Muslim faith that had committed this kind of act, immediately they would go to this idea that, as the president has, this bogus idea that we have to keep all Muslims out of the country, which is absolutely ridiculous. Yeah. I think instead what we need to do is address the issue with common sense gun reform and also address this toxic white supremacy that is brewing in the country.
Julian Castro, I know it's a tough day for Texas, tough day for America. More people dying in the last 24 hours than we had troops in Afghanistan die in the last 2 years anyway. It's been a rough weekend. Thanks for coming on and sharing your views, sir.
Thank you.